There are two main justifications for science, and one of them, I suppose, is the utilitarian one, that it's useful, and people will justify saving rainforests because you can get medicine from tree bark and things like that. But I agree with what you've just said, that there's something much more important, which is the sort of poetic benefit of science. The utilitarian benefits of science are not a good enough reason. I think it's rather like, I've used this example before, it's rather like saying that the point about music is that it's good exercise for the violinist's right arm. Science is much more like music in the sense of the aesthetic appreciation of music. And just as you don't have to learn an instrument like the violin in order to appreciate music at a very high level, so you can appreciate science and you can enjoy science and you can feel the thrill of the aesthetic thrill of science without actually being a scientist. So you don't have to have made a youthful study of the Bunsen burner in order to appreciate the music of the spheres, the majesty of the heavens, the majesty in another sense of the geological record, the sheer age of the rocks, the immense complexity of a single living cell, let alone the immense complexity of the trillions of living cells that is each one of you. So, and you. And me. So, I suppose that what Neil was talking about is kind of intermediate between the violinist's right arm, the utilitarian, mundane value of science, and the Carl Sagan sort of poetic value of science. The advantage of the scientific way of thinking, of not getting a cockeyed view of the world in which you find yourself. Science has developed methods of avoiding fooling yourself. Scientists are not necessarily more honest people than anybody else, but the methods of science have honesty built into them. We have peer review, we have the necessity for experiments to be repeated before they're taken seriously. We have the virtue of inter-observer correlation. It shouldn't matter who does the experiment. If the experiment is done in Japan or America or India, if the experiment's done properly, it should get the same result. Scientists don't appeal to authority. That kind of correct view of reality, as opposed to a tradition view of reality or a revelation view of reality, that seems to me to be a third virtue of science, which lies intermediate between the violinist's right arm on the one hand and the Carl Sagan in the upper stratosphere of poetry.
The big problem that we have in science education is we just do not teach science well. I always felt we never had a chance to really talk about what physics was all about. And when I tried to do that, there was no interest in it. It was just the students sat there, oh, is this going to be on the test? And one of the aspects of science that we're supposed to emphasize is critical thinking. And I don't know where in the science curriculum anybody learns any critical thinking.
Yeah, Neil.
Victor, I think you're under recognizing the value of your life experience in those roles. Let me offer, anecdotal though it is, reflections on just your point. People who are in school and maybe in a physics class, and perhaps they don't want to become a physicist or an engineer, they'll say, why do I have to learn about a frictionless pulley on an inclined plane with a massless? I mean, how will I ever use this? And in fact, you will never in your life encounter a frictionless pulley on a massless pulley on a frictionless inclined plane. Never, ever will that ever come up. Yet it's a physics problem in the physics book. And so I understand this, of course. However, there's something else going on there that we forget as educators, and particularly as physics educators. And that is in order to solve the problem in the first place, there's a new wiring of the brain that gets connected. And even after you forget the details of having solved the problem, the wiring in the brain that was established to have solved the problem lingers on. And I see this in the minds of adults. For example, Richard Holbrooke, who you may remember as the American ambassador to the UN during Clinton, he's a neighbor of the American Museum of Natural History, where it's my day job up there, in case you at the Hayden Planetarium. He wanted to take a tour of the newly built Rose Center at Hayden Planetarium right after we built it. And so I build the place, I give the guy the tour. And I start describing the moon, the planets, the stars, and he starts asking questions. And he says, is it true that if the moon is aligned this way, you get this phase before this eclipse takes place? I said, well, yeah, actually, yeah. We're walking around, and he says, well, if this galaxy rotates, do the stars move through the gas clouds, or is it all one? Oh, well, actually, it goes this way, and you trigger star. And he's asking questions deep in the content. And I say, now wait a minute, you're like a politician. You're a negotiator in the Balkans. Where does this, what? And he said, so I took physics when I was in college, before I shifted over into international law. And then it was just plainly obvious that this man had solved frictionless pulley problems, because he knew how to get to the essence of a problem. And then I asked him, how does that reveal itself in the negotiating table? You as a politician, how does this show up? He said, you know immediately who's basically full of it and who isn't. Because they're constructing alternative realities that have no foundation in the real reality. And so Victor, don't give up on yourself too quickly. All right.
Yeah. I should mention that I grew up in this area, and when I was about 15, my mother took me to the Hayden Planetarium. It was around 1950 or something like that. And that really got me into science. So Neil, you did a great job. But yeah, you're right, and I have to admit that there's something happening in the process. I'm just claiming that the people who are coming out are still not thinking critically the way we want. Why is it that so many of them, for example, still will come out of the science education and still believe in religion? I mean, it's just, is there when you walk into a church, is there a place there where you leave your brains, deposit brains here? And it's something I think we've all had to puzzle about.
Richard. Yeah, Richard.
In biology education, we have very much the same kind of problems, but we have one massive additional problem, which is that the central theorem of biology is evolution. And in the case of evolution, well, there are, of course, difficulties in understanding evolution, which are genuine difficulties, which are comparable to those in understanding physics. In order to really understand evolution, you have to get your mind around incomprehensible time spans. Nobody can really grasp what 1,000,000 years means, let alone what 100 million years means, because our brains on the Pleistocene of Africa were geared to understanding time spans of seconds, minutes, hours, days, years, decades, maybe at most centuries. We can't cope with 1,000,000 years, we certainly can't cope with 100 million years, and yet you've got to, or you won't understand evolution. Similarly, there's a tremendous interference put up by the fact that we are an artifact-creating species, and therefore, when we see a mechanism like an eye, a biological mechanism like an eye, our mind instantly leaps to artifacts, and we instantly think there has to be a maker. And these are all legitimate difficulties which are soluble by patient explanation, and I've devoted my whole adult life to trying to provide such explanations. But we have to face the fact that in the case of evolution, we have one massive roadblock to education, and that is religion. Because in the case of evolution, I think almost uniquely in science, maybe the Big Bang is subject to similar problems, we have a competing worldview which is actively engaged in a political process of deliberate subversion of the educational process. And so, whereas a physicist who is trying to get across the charms of balls sliding down inclined planes, etc., has the ordinary problems of education and yet students wondering whether it's going to be on the test, biologists have all that problem as well, but they have the additional problem that the student will say, oh, I don't believe that because I'm a, you name it, Muslim or Catholic or whatever. I was visiting a school a few days ago doing a filming project and was talking to these children they were 15 or 16-year-olds about evolution. And time and again I would get somebody who would say, oh, well, I know that's what we're told in school, but I don't believe that because I'm a Muslim. It says in the Quran, or it says in the Bible. And I put it to them straight, do you mean to say that if the evidence says so-and-so, and your holy book, whichever one it happens to be, says the opposite, do you mean you prefer your holy book over the evidence? And they said, of course we would. There was no question about it. 15, 16.
And where were you?
In England, in London. There was one young man who was raised Muslim, and he was totally close-minded. More than just closed-minded in the ordinary way that any of us might be closed-minded. His mind had been systematically closed by an educational process in early childhood, and it's a massive additional barrier that we have to face as educators in the field of evolution.
I have to make a quick agreement with Richard here. At the planetarium, we have a tandem projection space where we recreate the first few moments of the universe in what we call the Big Bang experience. And of course, this is part of a larger museum of natural history. And occasionally, I'm confronted by a religious person who asks, well, where is the religious view of the beginning of the universe? And so, rather than actually engage them in that conversation, I send them over to the Hall of Evolutionary Biology, and then they never come back. They never make it back to me. Because in those halls we have chimpanzees holding hands with human skeletons, and so they just never show up again. So forgive me, but I'm sending them all over to you. But I'm sorry, the question?
While it appears there's consensus that religion deserves the biggest bullseye in terms of it being the biggest impediment to science education, but there are other...
Well, I forgot to mention postmodernism, there is a kind of view which is being put about in social science and arts departments of universities, that there's nothing special about science, and science is just one version of truth, and your version of truth is just as good as my version of truth, and we all decide what's true for us, and never mind about evidence. Who says evidence is important? Isn't evidence just a white male supremacist concept anyway?
The common statement that you hear, where did the universe come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? Simple answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that is that nothing is unstable. Nothing is not the most natural state. Something is the more natural state of existence.
Yeah, but Victor, okay, but I'm okay with that, but even if we didn't yet have an answer to it, we should not be ashamed of not having answers to all questions yet. So you shouldn't somehow take the list of questions that the religious community poses to science and say, well, what was around before the Big Bang, and there were this, and after death, and I say, I don't know yet, and go on to the next problem. And I'm perfectly happy staring somebody in the face saying, I don't know yet. And we got top people working on it. And so, the moment you feel compelled to provide an answer, then you're doing the same thing that the religious community does, providing answers to every possible question. By the way, what science also does is not only answer well-posed questions, it also can put you in a position to judge whether, in fact, the question has meaning in the first place. And just because you put nouns and verbs in the right sequence doesn't mean your question has to have any sense at all. If you ask, what is the square root of a pork chop? That doesn't... At what temperature does the numeral 7 melt? Just because you ask that question doesn't obligate me to say, hey, let's fund the lab to answer it. And so science inquiry is also, half of that effort is constructing the questions in the first place.